Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm very happy to come here to share my thoughts about ME/CFS, both as a family that's been affected by this illness, and also as a researcher who's now working on it. So for the last 2 to 3 years, I've been developing a research program which will try to give us a better understanding of this illness, and also to develop a diagnostic test based on molecular biomarkers. And I think in New Zealand, we're the only group that is actually working on molecular studies for this illness, although, of course, there's a lot of interest and activity internationally. However, I first came in contact with this illness over 20 years ago when our vibrant and full activity daughter suddenly had a health down spiral into a severe fatigue illness. And this was followed several months after quite a severe attack of glandular fever. I must say I was fascinated when I got over those small moments when you escape from the emotional trauma to the family of this, with the fatigue. And I tried then to mount a research program as a biochemist on the energy powerhouse of our cells, the mitochondria, which might have had the key to what was going on in this fatigue. But I discovered an important lesson then, and that is when you have an illness which is not understood by the health profession and not believed by many health professionals, even though you might have a compelling research proposal and very good skills to deal with it, you won't get funded, and I wasn't. So that actually died. I have to say that, of course, many patients don't like the term chronic fatigue syndrome because it seems to perhaps demean the debilitating effect of the illness. You know, when I go on my Sunday exercise up Fraser's Gully, I'm chronically fatigued the whole time I'm going up the hill. And of course, fatigue is the most common illness which is presented to GPs. However, I must say for me, the fatigue that we saw in my daughter was just dramatic. I called it pathological fatigue. She was virtually bedridden, and she could struggle each day a few metres to the shower, sit down, have a shower, struggle back to her bed, and it took 2 or 3 hours for her to recover from that. I mean, just quite amazing. So when a young teenager loses the ability to carry out all of her normal activities and let alone go to school, this is very traumatic, and it completely changed the dynamic of our family for a number of years. We had a typically noisy, teenagery type household, but when this illness came on, we had to have a very quiet environment. We had to restrict light to where my daughter was, and we had to even restrict sort of odours because these things were torture to her at that time. At the same time that the fatigue came on, she suddenly became allergic to many foods. In fact, I might even exaggerate a little and say most foods. And my wife worked tirelessly to get together ingredients where she wouldn't show these dramatic food allergies and create meals that she could have and we could have together as a family. Of course, this was at the time when the World Health Organization in 1992 validated the illness as a neurological illness. And certainly we saw in my daughter the classic brain fog that is reported with this illness. And she was a very well-performed student at school before the illness came on, and we certainly saw severe effects on her cognitive ability at the time. One of the most interesting things to me was the connection between the food allergy and brain function. Quite often, 15 or 20 minutes after having a food that she was going to have an allergic response to, we could see visible effects on sort of brain activity and how it was. So this was, quite an interesting and dramatic sort of disease. Obviously, when you're affected as a family with this, as I'm sure many people in the audience know, you're quite traumatized and you look for help. And we look for help, of course, within the health system. We were at a big advantage as a family because my wife and I were both health professionals. My wife worked at the hospital. I worked at the university in the health sciences division. However, what we found was there was no really knowledge and understanding of this illness. There were some doctors who tried to be very helpful. One who I knew well said, what you need to do is to get her to exercise as much as possible. We now know this is the worst thing you can do. And although we tried to have a graded exercise program, simply lifting, lying on the floor, lifting her legs and arms up, this made actually the illness worse, unfortunately. There were other health professionals who, from a platform of ignorance, gave other kinds of advice, like she's just trying not to go to school, and of course had shifted the diagnosis into the default box, which was, it's a psychiatric illness, which of course wasn't very helpful. Just in the last week or two, I've received from the United Kingdom DVDs of a documentary that was made in 2011 by a mother and brother of a young woman in the UK who was affected with ME/CFS and has had it for 22 years, rather similar to my daughter. And I'd like to read what's on the back of this. It's a very harsh indictment of the kind of treatment that was available in the health system in the UK. And it says, hidden away in dark and silent rooms for years on end, men, women and children are suffering. Although severely ill, many are disbelieved and denigrated and their lives shattered by medical neglect and even abuse by the very professionals who should care for them. That's a pretty harsh kind of statement. Did we kind of experience this? Well, I have to say we did find some very caring nurses and doctors who were trying their best to understand what the disease were about. But I would be disingenuous if I didn't admit that there were some health professionals who communicated quite clearly to my daughter and also to us that they didn't believe that she was actually suffering from this debilitating fatigue illness. Okay. So I said then that the health system really wasn't providing the kind of support which we desperately needed. So where do you find support when you're suffering from this as a family? And I have to say there were one or two incidents which were quite helpful at the time. I don't remember how this occurred, but I'm sure my wife was involved in arranging it, that a young South African girl who had had the same debilitating effect with the disease a couple of years earlier somehow got to New Zealand, and she came and visited our home and was about the same age as my daughter and talked to her. And this was incredibly validating because my daughter could see she wasn't alone with this illness. Here was someone else of her age who had gone through it. It was particularly validating, I think, for us because we could see a young woman who was certainly had recovered somewhat from the debilitating state, and so we thought, well, this is something that we can look forward to, although I must say that it actually took a long time. We'd been part of the Wakari Union Church family, and that church family had known my daughter since she was a baby, and for me personally, a very validating event was the church family could see we were a totally stressed out family and put on a special prayer evening dedicated to my daughter. And the validating thing was that they didn't ask any questions about the illness. There was no whispering in the corridors. They just did it for support. So those things were very helpful. My daughter herself developed an intense spirituality which really has helped her through her illness right to where she is today. This is not of the conventional type that I was just talking about, her own kind of personal spirituality to give her some personal support. So, what I was learning at this time is that ME/CFS is a totally different kind of illness. And what I was picking up was our medical system isn't really geared to deal with an illness like this. For example, my daughter had frequent hospitalizations in the early period. And of course, what happens in hospitals? Well, the blinds go up early in the morning and the patients are sort of aroused, and there's a visiting system which then was much more sort of generous, I think, than it is now. And so patient rooms were quite noisy. My daughter needed 14 hours of sleep at this time. And if this didn't occur, then this was a very stressful thing. So she found hospital life very stressful with this illness. The other things we take for granted are going for appointments with health professionals. I go to my doctor now, and sometimes I see him within 10 minutes or 20 minutes or half an hour of the designated appointment. I take a research paper to read while I'm waiting. I don't think about it. But in those times when we had to go to a medical appointment and wait, this was a very stressful thing for someone acutely ill with ME/CFS. And when you go to a hospital appointment, sometimes you have to wait for an hour or more. And I remember one where we waited for more than an hour, and then my daughter got to see the specialist, and the specialist included that she was a highly anxious young woman. In reality, she was just completely exhausted from waiting for the appointment for an hour and a half. So I got to ring up receptionists and say, you tell me when the doctor's almost ready to see my daughter, and then I'll bring her down. Some of them weren't very receptive to that, but that helped to sort of get over that problem. Another thing I was quite surprised at, we live with this illness as a family minute by minute, and we felt we had a lot of information to give to the health professionals, because the illness was not understood. But we didn't find very much curiosity to seek our information, and when we tried to give it, wasn't actually that well received, I have to admit. As a scientist, I was surprised at the lack of curiosity, but I realised the medical system exists on a differential diagnosis. So doctors go through various boxes, and then if it doesn't fit one of their boxes, it tends to then go to the default box. So that, again, was not very helpful. At the time, I was reading about a UK patient that actually went round about 10 different specialists in different specialities. And each specialist, I'm sure, was a very caring doctor and tried their best with the patient, but they came up with a diagnosis in their own specialty. So after this, the patient had 10 different diagnoses. And I think this tells us that, this kind of silo type dividing the medical system into individual parts is not very helpful to this illness. And I was amazed when I read Ros Belling's book that was published last year, because she had 14 chapters on the systems in the body that are affected with this illness. I'm going to read them to you because I think this is quite dramatic and it makes the point. Chapter 3, the immune system. Chapter 4, the blood. Chapter 5, the musculoskeletal system. Chapter 6, the brain. Chapter 7, the eye. Chapter 8, the endocrine system. Chapter 9, the circulatory system. Chapter 10, the respiratory system. Chapter 11, the ear, nose and throat. Chapter 12, the mouth and teeth. Chapter 13, the gastrointestinal tract. Chapter 14, the liver. Chapter 15, the kidneys and urinary tract. Chapter 16, the skin, hair and nails. Chapter 17, the reproductive system. This tells you that this is not an illness that you can deal with by looking at a narrow sort of sector. And you'll see as I get on to the kind of research we're trying to do that we're trying to think of it now in a global way. So just to conclude this part, what I want to say is that when a young person or an adult is affected with this illness, certainly health professionals need to validate that, to accept and believe people and not leave them with the feeling that they're not believed. They're stressed out enough with ME/CFS without having to carry the stress of not being believed with the illness. And for a young person like my daughter, I mean, young people aren't used to chronic illnesses, so friends drift away. And last year, Ros and I were at a Bay of Plenty support workshop one weekend, and a young woman came up to me, you know, with tears welling in her eyes, and said to me that it was a very poignant and sad conversation, that her parents had not accepted her illness, and her father particularly, and he was trying to tell her she should sort of get up and join life, and she should be going to school and she should be doing that. And this was clearly very traumatic for her. So, you know, people need to have what they're suffering validated and believed, and that's really important. So what's the situation now then, 20 years later? You know, have we got an improved knowledge and appreciation and support? And I have to say some really good things to happen. I mean, New Zealand's very lucky to have a GP of the calibre of Ros Vellings, who's been on the international scene contributing to this illness and has worked tirelessly around the country to educate GPs on its nature, as difficult as it is. We have the national support organisation, ANZAMES, which I think is doing an excellent job, and Heather's had a major role to play in that. And locally we have MEISS, Otago and Southland, which has continued to provide support and information for people. So that's all great, but we still have a way to go. I talked with Ros last Friday on the phone and asked her, do Auckland medical students get, as part of their formal coursework, information about ME/CFS. She said there have been some outstanding workshops run by individual medical people in the medical school at Auckland, and they have been very well received by students, but she thinks it's sporadic. In Dunedin, I talked to a recent graduate who once worked with me and asked her whether in fact she had any formal education. She said she heard nothing about the illness during her medical training, except from the occasional derogatory comment just thrown away by one or two of the teachers. This is just not acceptable. There are over 20,000 people in New Zealand that are affected with this illness. And, you know, I work on Alzheimer's as well, and Alzheimer's currently has 48,000 people. So this is not a rare condition, and it should actually receive, I think, much more attention within the, you know, the teaching part, so that medical graduates will have a good appreciation of what the illness is about and will be empathetic and understanding with patients that they see. I just want to say a word now about complementary medicine. I have to say, before I experienced this illness, I of course firmly believed in evidence-based medicine, and I probably was pretty sceptical of complementary medicine, but I didn't condemn it or dismiss it. Since going through 20 years of this illness with my daughter, I have to say that I have a much greater respect now for complementary medicine, and as a scientist, I'm healthily sceptical about both conventional medicine and complementary medicine. But the critical thing is that when patients don't find much in the conventional medical system to support them, I think it's amazing that they actually try and take charge of managing their illness. And I'm amazed how effective the patient group is in getting that information, even when lying on their beds. And my daughter does this. She's on the internet and finding out, you know, lots of different things. And what they are doing is, this is personalised medicine, which is coming now into the conventional system, where they're trying things to see if they actually improve their condition. And some things might, and so that's a valid thing. Some things won't, and then that can be put aside. I mean, we're now able to think about this with drug therapies and conventional medicine, because we've known for some time that some drugs affect some patients favourably but seem to have no effect on others. And we understand now from the genetics and the new technologies, we're starting to understand why that is. So, you know, accessing complementary medicine is a very kind of similar sort of process. And the reason I've changed my views on this with my daughter's illness is because I've seen things for myself where she as a patient has gained a lot of benefit and help from them, and that seems to me the cutting edge thing about what any medical system should be doing. It should be benefiting the patient. Give you a couple of examples. In the early stages, my daughter quite frequently used to be very stressed at night sometimes and be in a lot of pain. And my wife met a woman in Dunedin who ran a practice called Healing Hands, I think it was. And so in desperation, one night we called her at 3 a.m. in the morning and she came, and I was just amazed how she could actually relieve the pain that my daughter was having and calm her body down, so get her to a state of peace. She had remarkable gifts, and it really kind of shook my belief system when I saw that. A little later, we had a Reiki teacher come up to the house to teach my daughter Reiki. This is also a Healing Hands thing developed in 1922 by Japanese Buddhists. And she taught my daughter to do this on herself so that when she was going into a distressed state, she might get some relief. And I have to say it worked. Not only did it empower my daughter to help managing her illness, but she was able to actually diminish when the strength of the symptoms when distressing symptoms came on. Throughout her whole illness, she's actually used craniosacral therapy very effectively. When she's feeling really kind of pretty rugged with the illness now, she always gets some benefit from this. It was developed by John Pledger in the 1970s. In Florida, my wife is now a craniosacral therapist and has been to Florida to learn all about that. These kinds of therapies, some people think, of course, they're just mumbo-jumbo and they dismiss them. My view is that if these therapies can be shown to help people who are really in need, then they're effective, and each patient can determine for themselves whether, in fact, it is actually benefiting them. One of the major differences I realised in sort of experiencing this was that the complementary therapist has the time and willingness and flexibility to come to people that are very ill and actually minister to them, whereas our conventional system sadly doesn't allow practitioners that degree of flexibility. And that's one advantage of combining, I think, conventional and complementary therapies to help patients. And you know, I felt very sad when we had a doctor that had seen my daughter in one of her hospitalizations who wanted to help her, but it had to be that we had to deliver the daughter down early in the morning to get, you know, her time. That's the time she had available, and you know, this was just not feasible with this kind of illness, sadly. However, I want to finish quite positively before I start talking about what we're doing in my research. As I say, my daughter's now had the illness for more than 20 years. She lives with it every day. She can't live a normal life. She can't work in a typical sort of 9-to-5 job, but she's a very productive individual. She's found ways of being very constructive with her life and to manage her illness. And I have to say, we're incredibly proud of her and of her courage in going through the last 20 years. And for me personally, she's taught me an enormous amount just by observing how she's actually coped with this. And I know I'm a much better person than I was before she got the illness. So I guess, you know, every cloud has a silver lining. Okay, I want to now just switch and talk a little bit about the research that we're trying to do. I said that I wanted to start and look at the fatigue in the early stages of the illness, but that was not possible. But since then, I've watched the research and tried to kind of think about it. And one of the slightly disturbing things is the research, and although there's some very interesting research being done, a lot of it is very silo type research, just like the clinical diagnosis. That is to say, a researcher will have an idea and a pet idea and will develop a whole research program around that. This is what I call Empire State research, where you start with a premise, might be a bit shaky, and then you build a whole research program. If that foundation stone is not right, the whole thing sort of crashes down. And a lot of this doesn't seem of much immediate benefit to patients, so I've been a bit frustrated by that. I tell my research students that when you've got a very complex problem to look at, what we have to be is kindergarten kids. And what I mean by that is you stand back and you look at the complexity, as I'm sure kindergarten's kids do, and at least determine what you can see. And I've tried to do that with this illness. I mean, what we know is that in most cases it seems to be initiated by a virus. Maybe other microorganisms and even chemical toxins can do the same. The immune system is affected and it's chronically activated. I think we know the disease has got neuroinflammatory components to it. So those are basic things. But as I've mentioned with Roz's book, the whole body systems are affected. What we don't really understand is what's going on. And so an approach that I wanted to take is to see whether we can have a more global approach to look at all of the molecules in the body to see if we can actually determine what the illness is about. I have to say, I thought I was completely wrong on this in 2009 when there was a publication in the major science journal Science, research journal Science, which reported that samples from ME/CFS patients in the United States contained a retrovirus. And this looked like maybe this was the initiating virus. Retrovirus is like HIV, although it was derived from a mouse. I was excited about this, and it gave me a pathway back into research because we had been developing a novel therapy for HIV, and the tools that we had developed would have been directly applicable to ME/CFS if in fact this had held up. But sadly, this was again another example of the Empire State kind of research, whereas the initial premise was wrong. By mid-2011, it was discovered that the retrovirus that was in the clinical samples, but for some reason not in controls, had been contaminated from a laboratory. The samples have been contaminated by laboratory. We know that because the DNA was isolated, and it not only contained the retroviral sequence, but it contained what we call plasmid DNA, which is kind of how we manipulate DNA in a research laboratory. So, of course, the patient group had been incredibly excited about this, and they, of course, were devastated by this kind of result. So we went back to what we were planning to do, and the goals of what we're doing is to see if we can develop a simple blood test based on biomarkers to understand how a viral infection might switch the immune system into its current state, and we want to sort of examine as many molecules in the body as we can and cells as we can to see if we can discern the molecular pathways that are affected by this illness. Answer questions like, is it a homogeneous illness or other subgroups? What happens when a patient goes into a relapse, as they often do, a severe relapse? Can we see changes in molecular pathways? To do this, we've developed, and we're developing particular tools that are going to be useful, and we've also started a clinical trials. The first trial we want to do is with 10 patients and match controls in Dunedin. We've started recruiting for that now, and we subsequently want to extend that to a 40-patient study of Ros Vallings's patients, because she's had 5,000 people alone in her practice in the last 15 years. And these are very carefully diagnosed patients because she, is the best in New Zealand at understanding the diagnostic criteria and has helped develop the international clinical criteria that's currently used. For our diagnostic blood test, what we're trying to do is focus on two proteins in the what's called the innate immune system, or the antiviral immune system. We know that if we get a cold, which is a viral illness, small tags are put on these two proteins. They're actually phosphate molecules. And normally if you get a cold, they're on for 2 or 3 days and then they will come off again. But in ME/CFS, we think the chronic activation means these tags stay on all of the time. And we're going to try and quantitate those tags and see if that will be a specific test for ME/CFS. If we can validate this, we'll convert the test into an ELISA format that can be used in a chem-path laboratory. And what our vision, our hope would be that then GPs could actually order that test for people that come with possible chronic fatigue, and that might be a specific test which will say yes or no. I was inspired in 2012 by a paper which was a very self-indulgent study of a Stanford geneticist where he followed molecular pathways in his body over 726 days. There were cost over $2 million. There were 30-odd researchers on the paper studying him. But the interest to me was that he suffered 2 viral illnesses during this time. One was a simple cold, and you could see molecular pathways changing and then quickly changing back, as we would have predicted. But there was he got another viral infection, upper respiratory virus, respiratory syncytial virus, and interestingly enough, this is the virus which is more common than influenza virus at the moment in the winter ills that are around. With this, what he was able to show that there were major changes to the molecules in his body. Over 2,000 of his genes became more active, and over 2,000 became less active. And so this struck me, this sort of analysis is exactly what we need to do to get the global effects of what ME/CFS is doing on the body. Can we work out what genes are being affected and then do a molecular pathway analysis to determine what pathways in the body are being affected? The hope from this is this will actually tell us more about the illness. It'll tell us when someone goes into a relapse what is changing, and we hope that we will get further diagnostic markers out of this, but also maybe even get some potential therapeutic strategies that we might be able to apply. Now, I have to say, this is a very ambitious research program, requires intense activity. We've got some money to support it. We need more investment. And sadly, for people with ME in the audience, it's going to take time. But I have to say, Ros Vallings and I have got a pact between us that we're going to live to 120, so we can actually put many more years of research into this. I have to say, despite her illness last week, she's such a tireless, incredibly energetic person, in her 70s, that I think she's going to make it. I'm not sure I'm so confident about myself. Thanks very much.